Pound Agency's very first webinar hosted on Hemp Hound TV. And I've got two great guests with you, two industry heavyweights. First of all, and forgive me, I've got to get the glasses on, we have Mark Tallon, managing partner of the Legal Products Group. He has a doctorate in nutritional. Oops, hold on. I will get rid of me basically over talking myself. My apologies. Yes, Mark Tallon, managing partner at the Legal Products Group. He has a doctorate in nutritional biochemistry and higher degrees in food, European, and intellectual property law. He also has over 20 years' experience in the UK and European food industry, including with novel food submissions. Thank you very much for joining us, sir. It's an absolute pleasure.
You're welcome. I like the shirts.
Yeah. And of course, we've got Stephen Oliver, co-founder of the Canna-Consultants. Steve has been around cannabis for 45 years. He started in drug enforcement in 1998. He has an extensive knowledge on the war of drugs from both sides and why prohibition doesn't work. He's been involved with the medicinal aspect of the cannabinoid research, of cannabinoid research since 2013, when assisting his mother at her end of life, and he has been at the forefront of advising and drafting legislation for governments including Malta, the Isle of Man, Greece and Armenia. As a postgraduate lecturer and trustee of the I Am Billy campaign, there is very little he doesn't know about the regulatory landscape of all things cannabis. How are you doing, sir?
I'm great, Kevin. Great to be here. Nice to see you.
Thank you very much. It's certainly a star-studded lineup. I say star-studded, obviously, with you, both of yourselves, and maybe not so much me. But let's crack on, because we do have a lot to talk about. Now, I'm going to just share a screen a second here, just to bring up Steve's endeavors with the Canna-Consultants. This was placed up a couple of weeks ago, and if you haven't seen it, basically it is about bringing about, asking the FSA if they could consider bringing about a safety net for products that would breach the 10 mil ADI. Now, Steve, let's start with you properly. The recent 10 mil ADI has created a paradox for brands with products exceeding this recommended limit that are listed on the public list. Can you provide your perspective on the challenges these brands face and the impact on consumer choice?
Yeah, that's a big question. Well, the impact's been potentially catastrophic. We know that the FSA, and Mark will go into detail, have been sitting on this information since probably the early part of this year, certainly Q2. We've got people that are doing their best endeavours to become what we would call best regulatory compliance, and that involves a huge amount of work and a huge amount of money and the commitment to the novel food process. So as part of that, we know when this started in 2019, and then we had the various announcements in February the 13th, 2020, and then the deadline for the dossiers. There was an absolute out-and-out encouragement, or I would say a direction, that there was a need for animal testing to look at the 408 studies, the 90-day force feed toxicity. And what we know is that the Food Standards Agency have received quite a lot of information. And the big issue here is that they've looked at a very, very small select number of studies when we know they're sitting on much wider information. So what do we have? We have an exceptionally overcautious regulator, which we accept. We have two advisory bodies. So we've got the Committee on Toxicity, we've got the Advisory Commission for Novel Foods and Processes, and basically they provide information to the FSA, and the FSA have no choice but to act on it. So they've identified from their work, from looking at this limited amount of data, we would say that there is a potential consumer detriment for certain groups, and they've extended that to healthy adults who would consume more than 10 milligrams of CBD a day over a course of time. Now, it's interesting when you look at the wording between the two, when you look at the FSA statement and you look at the COT statement, and just not to get into too much detail, but the FSA are saying that there's a potential risk. The COT position is that it cannot be ruled out So when you use words like it cannot be ruled out, you've been exceptionally overcautious. So what's the upshot? So the upshot is we get an advisory, and the advisory is 10 milligrams per day. And then we have the public list. So we have this list that people have strived to appear upon. You know, it's the top of the pops chart for CBD products, and it's probably more expensive than releasing a single and doing all the marketing. So to try and get into that chart, you had to jump through the hoops. Now you're in that chart, and you've got a consumer product, which is a single-use consumer product, such as a gummy, a capsule, or a drink. And the problem is, you've made that application with maybe 15 milligrams, 12 milligrams, 20, 25 milligrams. And what the FSA are saying is, this is advice to the consumer. It's not binding. It's not binding. It's not legally enforceable. It's an advisory. But we've spoken to the retail consortium. We brought in a number of very, very big high street players. And what we're essentially saying is, if you're selling these products and you're not giving the consumer the correct information to make a choice, we think there's a perceived risk above 10 milligrams. And retailers, wholesalers, banks, insurers, merchant accounts, Amazon at some stage, and the limited advertisers have to take notice of that. So the first thing you want to do is, as a responsible company, as a responsible brand, as a responsible manufacturer, is comply with that. So compliance first, get a seat at the table and argue why that's not relevant later. And we saw a knee-jerk reaction. I say knee-jerk. It's probably not knee-jerk, but we saw Holland & Barrett remove upwards of 30 products. And that has a massive effect on confidence, on investor confidence, on expansion, on every level. And think about the person working in the company. That's their job. So when they hear this news, their job's at risk. So what we wanted the FSA to do was allow people, whether they agreed or not, or didn't agree with this advisory, to be compliant with it. And what we have is this clash of policies, or an advisory in an absence of a policy to accompany it, with a rather strange situation where if you were to attempt to comply with the advisory, you would no longer be able to market your product, but you can market your product, which is non-compliant with the advisory, if it's a single consumer unit, and remain on the public list. So we know from talking to the Food Standards Agency that they identify this as an issue. They actually said to us on a call that they thought it would be confusing if they issued that policy at the same time as this advisory. I'd argue that it was quite confusing not to do so, but that's, you know, another conversation. So we know that they're going to look at this. And the important question here is, what will happen in the future? And I don't think it's good news for the industry, to be honest with you, because we've streamlined the applications. So we've got what I call the isolates, so we've got the 98% plus. I think you could split it into isolate, distillate, and full spectrum. You could forget full spectrum now. And I think what we're looking at is an ability for there to be authorizations. And the moment you have an authorized product, so the moment you have a company who has an authorized CBD product that is, let's say, the risk assessment process, and the FSA clearly say that this ADI, and they like the word ADI, the acronym rather, this ADI will be the focus for the risk assessment. The sooner that you have that authorized product, how can you possibly allow products which contain more than that on the public list? So there's a lot more to come. And I also mark up at the start of the conversation, I don't think that it's not a coincidence that we have followed with the response to the advisory for the misuse of drugs. I don't think that it's a coincidence that those two have arrived at a similar time frame, and we can talk more about the impact of that later on.
Now, I just want to bring Mark in here, obviously with his credentials. This long-term use, I mean, we're not hearing any kind of definition on that. Is there anything in food law that kind of covers that at all?
I think they cover that within the opinion. I mean, an ADI is chronic consumption for a lifetime. So depending how old you are when you start taking your CBD product and how long you live, that's the length of time that they're talking about. So an ADI is pretty clear. We don't need a legal definition of that. We've got the scientific definition. This is what the ADI means. I think most of sort of the business facing issues, I think Stephen's covered, eloquently there. I think obviously the underlying concerns is what the FSA have pushed out there, who does it apply to? Is it supposed to be just for consumers, but by default it applies to business? If you accept the precautionary principle, in fact, the legal principle under General Food Law 178/2002, that you can only place safe products on the market and products that are not unfit for human consumption. So by saying there's a 10 milligram is the lifetime safety consumption limit, you're in effect saying that, well, okay, if you want to consume this more than, let's say, 90 days, which is what the studies directly prove, then you're going to have to accept then, okay, the ADI then comes into place. But ultimately, we've been consuming these products for at least 5 years. So what does that actually mean already? Given they've pushed out this information, if I was a food business and ended up in court and they've said, well, okay, it's unsafe at 10 milligrams, and above 10 milligrams, and we've been taking that for 5 years or longer, especially given the fact that our further discussion that we'll go into, I think the actual data is completely flawed. But I'll hold back on that. I think that there is further considerations there about okay, who does the ADI apply to, and what are the assumptions from that? Is it a consumer? Is it business? And I think that's where a lot of the difficulties have come from, and that's putting aside issues like transparency, fairness, there's a legal obligation to consult, and in effect, this guidance is generated almost like a legal position for industry, but under the guise of guidance. So that's something that we really should consider about why haven't the industry been brought in to discuss this, given that the dossier has been sitting in the FSA's hands potentially up to 7 months. But that in itself suggests a number of things that we do 90-day studies that cover safety for 3 months, but if they were really concerned beyond 3 months, then this advisory would have been issued straight away as soon as the scientific committees would have published that data. But they didn't do that. They waited 7 months, which is double the amount of time frame that we've got in our 90-day studies that we submit to Novel Foods. So that sort of goes against, what happens after the acute subchronic phase of 90 days. So there's quite a lot wrapped up in that, which I'm sure we can go through.
Another point there, Kevin, for Mark, which Mark's pointed out previously, is that the FSA have chosen not to follow this advice historically. So they've thrown caution to the wind when they've been told that it should be even lower, and they've said no, 70 is fine. And now they've just welcomed this advice and welcomed it, sat on it for 7 months, and then issued it.
It's interesting what they actually said in the scientific committee in this position paper. They referred back to the decision of the FSA to talk about the 70 milligram level as a pragmatic approach to safety. Whereas obviously, as you said in the original report, the 20 and then the update in 2021 was at 4 milligrams. But the FSA decided against that and went for 70 milligrams, which now the scientific committee said the 4 milligram was an absolute maximum, to use their own words, a maximum. So it's interesting that the FSA, like you said, decided not to apply the guidance given at that time, given the liver effects seem to be the main concern. And then this time they've accepted directly the 10 milligrams, which is quite unusual. And again, we're not provided any data or information about what's changed over that period outside of the 3 specific studies that we'll discuss.
Okay. I find it weird that we've got the MHRA list, which is supposedly for medicines and vaccines, but it does include CBD products as well. And certainly on there doesn't seem to be any kind of indication of liver issues or thyroid issues from CBD products. Like I said, it is for medicines and vaccines, but there are food supplemental products listed on there, allegedly for report.
Well, it's death, isn't it, Kevin? Death and influenza. I mean, it's nonsense. That list does not refer to CBD supplement products. It's medical, it's misuse of medical products, and it's products that have not been manufactured correctly. So that is not a reference point for the safety of CBD products.
Fair play. So let's move on to the second question then, Steve. In your recent statement, you highlighted the dilemma brands encounter when attempting to comply with the 10 milligram ADI by reducing the CBD content of their products. Could you elaborate on the FSA's classification of such products as new to market and how this affects their eligibility for the public list? Okay. I know you touched on it a bit, but
yeah, I mean, we had the announcement on the 13th of February 2020 from the FSA, giving us the deadline to submit a novel food application by the following March 2021. And the information at that stage was if your product was on the market on the 13th of February, the 12th of February 2020, and then you had this, and then you supplied a satisfactory, a novel food application that was accepted, not validated, accepted, then your products could remain on the market. So that was quite clear. Let's put to one side all of the shenanigans that have gone on as to whether or not products were on the market, what the definition is. But that's what we've been working to. So we've got this list. And that in itself is strange because that's not legally binding. And to make it quite clear, it's an advisory document for trading standards officers and local enforcement. And it's very strange because you can have a company that never marketed their product because they abided by the law, because in 2019 it was a novel food, you shouldn't bring it to market. So they abided by the law, put a novel food application in, they're now validated, yet because they weren't on the market and they broke the law for a shorter period of time than anybody else, they can't sell their products. So the whole thing's very strange. But I take it, when you listen to the FSA, what they could have done was just removed all products from the market. So let's thank heavens for small mercies. The situation we've got at the moment is that you can't amend the product. So it prohibits white labeling. So it essentially stopped any form of expansion of the UK manufacturing market and handed an advantage to Europeans and Americans, because no one's stopping these products coming in. So a lot of any new products or changes are coming in unabated from abroad. So we've got a situation where it's stymieing the industry, and we're not allowed to change the formulation. So we can change the manufacturer as long as the ingredient remains identical. So as long as the ingredient is the same, you can change the manufacturer, but the branding and the contents have to remain consistent. So what you're not allowed to do is take a gummy, have it manufactured with the same CBD ingredient, with exactly the same ingredients, apropos thickener, flavoring, gelatin, whichever process you use, the inulin, packaging the same, consuming units the same, but you're not allowed to reduce that to 10 milligrams. Now, that seems to me to be very strange, because you would hope, as a food regulator whose primary role is to prevent consumer detriment, that they would embrace that and allow people to do that. We don't think that's complicated. We don't think that they would open the floodgates if it was very simply stated that any company with a single consumer unit, which can be defined as a capsule, a gummy, a drink, a portion of chocolate, any digestible single consumer unit that is on the public list, they are able to change one thing only, and that is the amount of CBD. Now, that would be a stopgap. The reason that hasn't happened is, I believe, for a number of reasons, and two more importantly, I think more is to come here. And I think more is to come, which is the public list element has always caused conflict. It's conflict legally, conflict from a proportionality perspective. And proportionality is a big issue for the FSA because they have to act proportionally. We are getting to the stage where we will have authorization. Now, whether that is a synthetic to begin with or whether that is an isolate, it is abundantly clear from everybody that seems to be the safety. What people forget is we're looking at CBD. We're not looking at a CBG application or a CBC application. We're not looking at the controlled cannabinoids. We've got a simple question. If this is a narcotic, a drug, it cannot be a food. So if it's not a drug, it can be a food, and the FSA can move forward. And that's the relevance of this recent Home Office intervention. So we have a situation where we're actually looking at CBD. Now, unless somebody wants to put an application in for CBG, or they want to put an application in for their ingredient, which contains, amongst other things, other cannabinoids, then that's never going to progress. So we are looking at a highly purified fast track, if you like. And fast track's a bit perverse, but novel food applications can take 5, 6, 7 years. So this is not particularly slow, but let's say we are moving towards authorizations. I go back to my earlier point. when we have an authorized CBD product, and I expect the first ones to be next year, then you cannot have a public list which permits or encourages non-enforcement and retailers to stock a product which is not authorized apropos the authorized product, because that's just disproportionate and that just undermines the whole purpose of the process. So I think it's confusing. I don't expect anything to happen quickly, unfortunately. I think there will be a policy, but I think the policy will be how they deal with the public list. And the real unfairness then, which will be, you are continuing through the risk assessment process, but you now have authorized products, and how they manage that transition. So essentially, you would have the public list would no longer exist. You'd just have authorized and unauthorized products. One could be sold and one couldn't. And they've got to work out how to transition that period. And I think hopefully that's where the industry consultation, which we're led to believe is imminent, will find a new stopgap. And hopefully it doesn't create as many problems as the last one did.
I'm not certain whether I'm going to be invited on that, which should be a shame. But then, maybe I say too much.
You should be, Kevin. You should be.
Thank you. Mark, when it comes to your experience in novel foods, has there ever been a hang-up that you're aware of in regards to new to market products where, say, for example, someone could just take a box of gummies and package one and sell that on, and it wouldn't be a new to market product? Or are we in once in a novel food lifetime situation with CBD?
Yeah, I mean, there's never been an approval of something that's in effect illegal. So this is the first time that, at least in my knowledge, that we've ever seen this. And obviously you wouldn't see it at European level. So it's unusual to sort of get something that's, in effect, completely against the legislative framework. It shouldn't be on the market, but it's been permitted. So it's not legal, but it's permitted. But there's lots of other things that are permitted. But, we are where we are. These things are on the market. They've been allowed to be sold. But my view of this whole situation is it's a slow death for the industry. And that's the big problem is the way that the FCA have done it by saying no new products causes, a huge issue. The longer the novel foods process goes on, the less people become interested in what's going on with CBD. The fact that we're stifled to a certain dose, which is made now obviously even worse with the ADI. But ultimately, the reason for that is obviously the FSA don't want the industry to grow. I know they'll say, "Oh yes, we want to see business do well and everything else." But the more success we've got, the more products that get sold, the increased risk of someone having a toxicity by taking that product because it's a novel food. Now we can argue whether that's the truth or not, but at a theoretical level, if you're putting something that's not being proven to be safe on the market, and more people start consuming it because you allow the market to flourish by being innovative with new formulation, new products, different delivery systems, you end up then put yourself in a situation where obviously more people can consume the product. Good for industry, but bad for the regulator who's decided, okay, we're going to allow free sale of the product. And that's my view why they've sort of restricted, innovation with the products. A lot of that is nonsensical. The fact that you've got an arbitrary date, these are legal, now they're not. You could have been on the market one day after, one day before. A lot of these issues, just don't make sense. But ultimately, it's in the FSA's interest, at least until there's an authorization, to have at least the least amount of this stuff circulating in the market. And that's what's really behind that in terms of the innovation side. There's lots of other issues wrapped around that, but that's what it comes down to in terms of not new products. But they're obviously concerned enough to not write that into law in something with legislative strength to just say, this is our view, this is our opinion. And obviously, as business, you can give the V's to that and decide I'm going to innovate if I want. And if you've got the money behind you, you could decide, okay, well, let's see what the courts say. But no, people have not done that, which is a shame given the fact that they've been willing to spend hundreds of thousands on another food dossier, but not challenge the FSA's views by judicial review. But that's why we probably are in a situation where we are with the ADI, because the FSA feels relatively secure. I think there's only been 2 judicial reviews, but they're timed out in effect. So we've never really seen what happened. But there could have been, and that would have put some more pressure on the FSA to think, okay, the industry are willing to react, are willing to obviously test this. I mean, in some ways we do test certain things. We have got THC in the products and there's a zero threshold, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of being able to innovate and come up with new products, I don't think the FSA are being pushed back on that hard enough. And that's partly probably why they're just making a decision, oh, he's the ADI, let's not consult industry, let's just say this is our view.
I have a slightly different view there because I hear this about judicial review and I, it bloody annoys me because I think it's a way of lawyers trying to make money. I don't think there's a hope in hell of anybody having a successful judicial review here because the simple fact of the matter is, we had we when we withdrew from the EU, had we abandoned this nonsense novel food regulations, then that would have been a different matter. But we haven't. It's enshrined in UK law, so the products are unlawful. So the default position is to be successful, you have to undermine the FSA's policy, which means the upshot is all products are removed from the market. So the FSA knows nobody is actually, of course, you'll crowdfund people, lawyers will take bloody money for anything, but no one is actually going to go through when there's, when they've got to demonstrate the funds when they lose, because the legal ultimate point is these products are unlawful. And I think the FSA is autonomous. It doesn't have ministerial control. We struggle to try and influence them. I mean, I agree with all the other points you make, Mark, but I think the industry was left without a legal recourse here, because legal recourse leads to the default position, which is there are no products on the market. And we've almost, to a certain extent, been not blackmailed, but cajoled into a submissive position because we don't have that legal avenue of complaint. And it's very sad for what's an incredible industry. The fact of the reducing, this down to 10 milligrams, I think the cotton have got their 4 milligrams, to be honest with you, because what no one disputes is how poor the bioavailability is of CBD when you take it orally. We know from the FDA tests that you've got probably 15%, great bit more with a full fat breakfast. So if you've got 10 milligrams, that's 1.5 milligrams. Liposomal, or the best bioavailability delivery mechanism, you're probably going to be astounded if you could achieve 4 milligrams actually having some form of effect at the 10 milligram level. So I think that level is so low. If it was 10 milligrams, then it should be above 70, because to ingest 70 milligrams of CBD to actually get anything to metabolize, it's going to be a fraction of that amount.
Now, first of all, I must apologise because the director of security and treats is saying hello to the cat, and I can't really stop him from doing much there. But I just want to touch on 2017 novel foods, because I've been in the industry long enough. There's plenty of people who will remember that in 2017, the FSA is supposed to have turned around to the CTA and said that isolates were novel, but broad and full spectrum products weren't. So it's like that has no bearing on anything whatsoever. Can I have your opinion on that, please, Mark?
An opinion of what's novel?
In regards to novel foods 2017, there was an announcement that from the FSA that suggested that isolate products were novel and that full and broad spectrum products weren't. And then as soon as we got to January 2019, it's almost like that never existed. That never happened.
Yeah, well, obviously there's the onus is on business to demonstrate that at least when they're in a position where there's a doubt that a product may or may not be novel, that they need to provide evidence that there is a history of consumption prior to May 1997. So the onus is on business to be able to prove to in this case, the Central Competent Authority, the FSA, that if they're questioned, that this stuff is not novel. And obviously, industry was given a chance to prove that all of these different forms of extraction are novel or not novel. Now, I think a lot of the confusion is, okay, there might be a history of consumption as a traditional herbal medicine, for example, but that doesn't mean that there's a history of consumption as a food, and that's where a lot of the confusion comes in. The secondary issues are things like, okay, we know there's a whole list of things that make something novel, such as, okay, what was the extraction process, applied to the product? Was that traditional? And is the final compound that we've got, is it something that was on the market prior to that date? If you want absolute legal assurance, then that's when you take the risk and submit an Article 4 dossier. My default position is don't ask if you don't want to know. And clearly, obviously, someone did want to know and asked. And that's what obviously triggered this situation, because we've been dealing with, hemp products, hemp protein for about 15 years. So it was never, ever an issue. It was only an issue, obviously, once these products started to become more refined. And that's where the debate comes in. And obviously, I've done a lot of work. I do a lot of work. I don't, work on anything to do with medicines. I can't advise you on vapes. My work is only on food. And there's nothing within the literature that proves that concentrated extracts have been consumed to a significant degree. Yes, there's some stuff on flavorings, etc., etc. It might have been in beer, but not what we've got in terms of what we consider as modern day isolates and other extracts we get from the cannabis plant. Yeah. So who knows what the FSA's data was and why they made that opinion? The problem is with a lot of these authorities, the same with trading standards. You've got a revolving door of staff with, a lot of experience getting ejected out, relatively poor staff that come in with a lack of understanding. And we've seen that when you've lost people like Chris Jones, who went to the MHRA. He was a big suck out of that, but he was useful then. Obviously, if you had medicinal issues, you want to sit down and have a chat when you're at the medicines agency. But that wasn't replaced then. And a lot of the knowledge that's not written down is taken with that officer. The same as someone who's got a lot of knowledge within the business. If that knowledge is not passed on, then it goes with that person. And that leaves you problems because the new people don't have historic context, how these issues should be dealt with, or bits of information that was actually really useful at that time. So who produced that view and why they produced that, based on what data? How was that data presented to them? And at that time, obviously, we were still, part of the EU. There would have been discussions with the European Commission. The Commission said, well, we haven't seen any data. We think it's novel. And there's probably then some pressure then back on, obviously, the UK to say, okay, we think that it's probably novel. And that's when we end up in the whole debate about, is it novel or not? And we had some dreadful presentations that were made at the European level that really put us in the shit, to be honest. And that's why we are where we are. But you can't go back. So that's my general views on them.
What about you there, Steve?
A much shorter. I think it's a nonsense question, Kevin. It's a red herring. I think we put the turkeys in. I didn't personally, but we put the turkeys in charge of Christmas back in 2017, and they asked the wrong question. The question is, if it's a drug, it can never be a food. So it's irrelevant whether somebody says full spectrum could be not novel, because then it can never be novel because it's not classified as a food. And you had the turkeys telling everyone no one's going to eat turkey for Christmas because it's 0.2%, when it was 0. So the question should have been, first question, do any of these products contain controlled cannabinoids?
But it was never precluded for it being a medicine or a borderline substance. It was precluded based on novel food grounds. The medicines issue, obviously, or narcotic issue, should I say, is a separate issue, which could have been dealt with.
It's the overriding issue, which still hasn't been settled now. And, to use the Home Office's own words, it's going to take careful consideration, which I would suggest is Home Office speak for. I don't think the ACI having their meetings this week will be able to tell us what legislation is going to be drafted in the next month. But no, I think people were misled, very badly misled, Kevin, by people who proclaimed to know what they were doing. And if you have lawyers who are telling people that they can have 0.2% THC content in their products, and people genuinely, honestly founded businesses and borrowed money on that basis, they're the people that should also be accountable. The FSA don't make these rules. The Home Office made the rules. It was law. And lawyers chose not to apply that law and misled people, and that's where those first mistakes came. And Mark's quite correct. If it's food, it would never come across Mark's desk because Mark would have looked at it and said, unlike a lot of other people, I'm afraid I'm not going to take your money because you're going to fall at the first hurdle because the FSA can't deal with this until we've got classification on whether or not you can have a level of controlled cannabinoids in a foodstuff. And at the moment, it's still 0. It may move to 50 micrograms, but we don't know what that will apply to.
Okay, let's move on to the next question, Steve. It's evident that the FSA's 10 milligram advice and the subsequent actions of brands and retailers has caused confusion in the industry and amongst consumers. What measures do you believe the FSA should take to provide clarity and support responsible brands during the transitional period that we're going through?
That's a two-hander. I mean, whilst I'm tempted to jump in and answer from a novel food perspective, I think, Mark and I have got clear roles, so I'm going to let Mark deal with all of the novel food things. What does it mean? It means uncertainty. I think it will stop any investment, because if you're about to put money into a company, you're going to hold off. You want transparency, and you need to know, you need clarity, and you need to know what the rules are. I think we're going to be in a period like that, and I think it's going to be through till after Christmas. It's a long time for a brand. I think the longer we don't have an announcement saying you can make a compliant product, and the longer the FSA solidifies this advisory, and it seems to be that it's creeping away from advisory to be a little bit more stringent, I think then you will see retailers back off. I think you will see people faced with potentially a recall. And the problem that you have is if you've made, let's say you've made 50,000 cans with X amount of CBD in, and all of a sudden a retailer turns around to you and says, we can't stop this because we're being told this is not safe. I'm contractually, it'll depend obviously on your supplier agreement, but I would imagine that stock's then either going to have to go outside of the UK, and you're going to bear the cost. Very few businesses have got that cash flow at the moment to be able to do that and pivot, and they have spent a huge amount of time. The stability work, the cannabinoid degradation, all of the ongoing work for novel foods that needs to be done on each of those individual products. Well, yeah, of course it should be directly referable, but they're now talking about looking at matrices and bioavailability. So I see this is a war of attrition. We will have a CBD industry in the UK. It won't be a full spectrum one, but it will be a step. Once we have an authorized CBD products, we can then start the fight on different fronts. But I think the war of attrition, the death of 1,000 cuts, will mean that industry is smaller. And one of the glaring omissions here is that nobody can lawfully manufacture CBD products under license in the UK, and that's a distinct economic disadvantage. And there's nothing to address that in the Home Office letter. So the industry needs help. It doesn't need people starting campaigns which result in you paying them lots of money. It's a time for the industry to keep hold of the little money it has within the business, preserve those jobs, and perhaps listen to people like Mark on the basis of the science, perhaps get behind collectively about some very short-term solutions that will allow more people to still be in business when we get those authorizations.
What's your thoughts on that then, Mark?
Yeah, I think I'd probably have different views if we could step back at the start of this process when the industry was aflush with cash. So I think retailers, and I won't go into the names of retailers, but they're more than happy to list non-compliant products, even products that are potentially unsafe. So going back a few years ago, because I've been involved in this, we had products with active ingredients in, like that you get in Senecot. Super successful, made a lot of money, and the retailers knew there was issues, knew that it was potentially medicinal, even received letters from the MHRA, but happy to stock the products. Now, that was simply because they made lots of cash. But because of all the issues that we've just discussed, the market is not as buoyant as it used to be. And as sort of Steve's alluded to there, companies need to try and retain what they've got. And it's I think the sales are probably really struggling to make any cash through, a traditional retail or specialty channel, because people are, the innovation's been stifled. There's not the interest in CBD products like there used to be. And even though we've got the restrictions over in the US, there's still innovation going on there all the time. It's got a different risk profile. There's different things that you can do with the products. You can bring new ingredients to market. And even though that may be illegal, the risk profile over there is very different to what we've got here. And that's an issue, because then it's like, okay, what do we do? about having our products listed in a retailer's, if we keep to this high dose, are they willing to take the risk, knowing they're not making that much money unless you're giving them a big bunk to list the products in the first place up front? What's their incentive to list some products that are relatively high risk and not generating a lot of cash? So this is why they're probably less tolerant, to keeping products that are above the 10 milligrams, at least initially, on shelf than what it is now. But this is why I think there should be a fight over this whole issue about what the report says and what the FSA have come out with. Normally, I'm not the face of the industry or anything else. But when I see sort of the science being, taken out of context the way it has, and it's just sort of, okay, well, this is the view. We've got no references in our study. We're still harping back to GW data. We're putting up these straw men of vulnerable populations that are just absolutely nothing to do with the food product. It just doesn't make sense. Ignoring studies that have come out over the last 7 months that would give you a completely different point of departure, a completely different ADI. Even the committee themselves making the decision that, okay, we're going to say it's 10 milligrams, but if you actually follow the EFSA guidance, it should have been 12 milligrams because they didn't round properly. The rounding is to two significant places. If it's more than 10% change from what it would have been, they ignored that. They decided to apply an uncertainty factor from subchronic to chronic of 3, when EFSA's position is 2, which would have doubled, the amount that we would have had. And these are like all of the problems that we've got that's resulted in the ADI. So my approach to this is more about, okay, we know these things have happened, but what's a practical solution? What can we do? And I think that's what I think I'm hoping from the discussion today is where I think, Steve's much better at this on the policy side of me because he's much more involved in historic stuff and dealing with the authorities. But my position is legal opinion and a scientific opinion. But I think there's a good mesh there, from us in this conversation to think, okay, there is an approach here, an initial approach, but a longer term approach of saying, okay, this direction of travel is not correct. And we need to change that. But we're at a position now where it's still advisory, it's still provisional, and it's not set in stone. So let's try and do something about that. And I mean, a lot of it is about information finding, which is, sort of your position, Kevin, is to find out, okay, well, why didn't the FSA act to the new data? What is their relationship with the subcommittees? Why are they not feeding back to them and vice versa? Why have we got this big gap? Why have they changed their view from sort of accepting and then not accepting position of the scientific committees? There's lots of things there. Why are the scientific committees not providing a full reference set to the data? They talk about tiredness. There's not a single reference in there, to what substantiates those type of claims. We've got at least 2 studies that show that, up to 300 milligrams and one study up to 1500 milligrams. Mm-hmm. There's actually the opposite effect. People are more alert, more awake during the day when they've been using CBD because they get a better night's sleep. It's nonsensical that they just say, this is my view, and this is what we should accept as the ADI. If we do a novel and food submission, and obviously Steve's been through this process, and we said, I was chatting to Matt last night, and we thought this is what the science means. Don't give any reference and just say, there's our novel foods dossier. It wouldn't have even got through validation. But we're expected to accept the scientific committee that's made up of scientists, independent scientists, who said, this is our view, but we're not going to reference anything other than now and again we reference GW. It's just very, very strange.
Kevin, can I just, onto Mark's part there, make some really important points. And then the difference, obviously, with the States, grass generally regarded as safe. We've got to refer to public data. You've got to release this information into the public domain. That's not happening here because of the data protection and this sort of Vulcan cloak of invisibility that the FSA have got on their data. But all the industry participants have actually got that data. Now, I understand individual clients who've spent, some of them up to £1 million or more on that data, may be reluctant to throw that out into the public domain. But surely the consortium, surely, IRE, and surely the ACI, to help the industry, would publish their data now to counteract the lack of data and to evidence that the studies they've conducted have data to justify an ADI at a much higher level. So that would be my call out initially. The fastest thing we could do is have a larger pool of transparent data that scientists can look at, so that Mark and I can look at that and say, actually, do you know what? The FSA are right. All these studies point to that danger. And we would be the first to do that, because that's what we have to do with studies. I very much doubt that's the case. So
they could have still provided that data and it'd be blinded. We've got 3 data points, okay? They don't need to tell us who they are. And they could give a description of, okay, it was an OECD 4-weight study, because they only say it's a 90-day study. They don't describe that. They don't say, well, was there any reprotox data that was provided? We've got weird thing of, we've got 2 hemp submissions, hemp extract submissions, and we've got synthetic. Well, we know there's a difference in the chemical structure between those 2 different type of compounds. And one, the synthetic, has a completely different effect on the CBD receptors, making it more psychotropic. So therefore, there's likely to be differences in toxicity. So why was that included as being equivalent to hemp extracts? So they could have disclosed the data. But the biggest one is, like I said, by the time it was published at the start of October, we had an ADI that was generated by Rita Henderson's group. We had our own study that was published on toxicity, including reprotox data, genotox data. So that was at least another data point that it could have included. And that come out with 30 milligrams for healthy humans and 100 milligrams in dietary supplements, providing you've got adequate labeling. We had our own data, which is probably wasn't included because we're 97%. But do you mean 97 and 98% purity is really going to make any toxicological difference? That could have been looked at as well as part of those data points, but it wasn't. We published that data, so we don't even have to worry about, disclosure. There's more now in the public domain in those peer-reviewed publications than there is from GW. We were happy to share that. So, there was a paper by Lowe et al. Only this year, again, before the actual publication of that data. It looked at 2,000 subjects, right? 2,000 subjects. And there was liver enzymes that were elevated, but 0 below 300 milligrams per day, which is nowhere near what we're asking for in terms of dietary products, dietary supplements. And obviously liver enzymes can be elevated for anything. If Steve's on a high carb diet today and I stick him on a high fat diet tomorrow, his little enzymes are going to be pumping out left, right, and centre.
If you force-fed me MCT oil probably for 90 days, Mark, maybe my liver would be inflamed. Yeah,
so it's an adaptive response rather than a toxic response. So then when we look at, obviously, drug-induced liver injury, which is what we're really concerned about, in that study, the Lowe study, which looked at, like I said, 3,000 people, there was only 2 from the healthy populations that had any evidence of drug-induced liver injury. And the dose, over 300 milligrams per day. So why do they keep referring back to the Epidiolex study, which is super physiological dosages, and it's why pick that over what's now in the public domain? They could have looked at all these other data points and exactly what Steve said. Why is this other information not being put in there? It's really quite unusual.
All we can hope, Mark, is that because I get it, and I'm not defending the regulators, but if your role is to look at data objectively to protect public health, then you would take the worst data and you would apply your rationale to that. What we have to hope and insist on and fight is that they look at the individual ingredients and then they look at the other data independently. Now, I think that's unlikely because you've got the products on the market, but
the way they assess is not consistent with history. So, for example, they talk about things like bioavailability and worried about bioaccumulation. We've got an opinion on coriander, which has got a specific compound that bioaccumulates in fat. We've got an opinion on chili pepper extract, which is dihydrocapsate. 4% of anything that you take of that product is retained within the body, therefore it bioaccumulates. Fat-soluble vitamins and minerals bioaccumulate. But why haven't we got the same warnings, the same ADIs on those type of products? the
because
way
it's not
they do with
cannabis,
those is not the same as CBD, and that's another part of the issue.
they're not looking at glucosinolates, and they're not looking at anything else with the level of over caution and risk aversion that they are with CBD. And that's a fact. But I think we have to accept that, because even though it's a compound of the plant, we've got 70 years of prohibition, and I think we start from a position of high risk, whereas we don't start there with duckweed or pea protein or egg alternative or ultraviolet baked bread. So they start with cannabis in their mind as scientists. A lot of them seem to be converted because they seem to be getting quite a lot of jobs in the cannabinoid sphere, but that's a conversation for another day. But I think transparency and maybe a sharing of data in the industry to put together a single comprehensive response, not saying rebuttal, but response can only be good.
That leads me on to my next question, as it goes quite nicely. How can the FSA strike a balance between consumer safety and supporting the industry's growth and economic contributions?
They could hand this to another government department. No, I mean, that's pedantic. I think they would say that they are. Their overriding objective is public health, and I think it comes back to the question that Mark and I have been trying to answer there, which is how do we allay the fears that they have with science? Because they haven't presented us with the science. And Mark's done an excellent presentation on the science, which we'll tell you about, which I would urge people who don't understand the intricacies to have a look at, because it is very technical, but it's not beyond anybody's ability to understand, and you can identify and pinpoint the details. But I don't think you can marry the two unless you treat everything proportionally. So every novel food process should be the same. What risks are we seeking to eliminate? What evidence is required? What's the standard? What's the burden of proof? And it is evident that CBD is being treated. There's a sledgehammer to crack a nut here. I think even the wording, I come back to the point, it cannot be ruled out. We don't live as human beings with risk that cannot be ruled out. We would have no cars. We would never move. Choking on a peanut. It cannot be ruled out that you choke on a peanut. It's nonsense.
What about you, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the same thing. I mean, this whole process is supposed to be risk assessment, not risk guarantee. Mm-hmm. And that's what you do when you're picking a level of risk. That's to protect the consumer. And I think there's been millions spent on demonstrating on all sorts of different cannabinoid levels here, and compositions and residues and everything else that's involved in this, to show that these substances, at least subacutely, are safe. And at that point, it comes down to, okay, going back to Steve's first point was, what's a proportionate response? Okay, market surveillance, which is what they do on all the other substances that have been novel foods. We even have that at the European level, and how strict those guys are when we come to things like additives. Every 5 years, they're reassessed because the science changes. They monitor, different parts of the population to make sure there's not any issues that come up. And we could have exactly the same here in the UK. We could even develop a system equivalent to something much better than the yellow card system, but at least a system of, monitoring what's going on, even if it's a subpopulation of heavy users. There's other options that we can use instead of saying, okay, let's go and kill another 4,000 rats, or, let's go and do X, Y, and Z. But yes, the FSA's responsibility is to keep the public safe. But it's also, again, it's got to follow its basic principles until we at least divert completely away from Europe. Things like proportionality, precaution principles, everything else, a right to legal certainty, mm-hmm. and those type of issues have got to feed into that process. We can't just say, okay, we're going to apply a completely different approach to CBD, because it sets a bar then for other ingredients, other compounds that might want to come on the market. Obviously, CBD is just the first one. We've got CBG, all the other type of cannabinoids that we might look at. And what does this mean then, obviously, for, more full spectrum extracts, full hemp extracts further down the line when we get to groups B and C. So I think, yes, we need safety. But I think there's a lot of data to prove that, at least over that 90-day period. And outside of that, labeling, market, watching the market after is a way to do that. And outside of that, obviously things like quality assurance, etc., which is sort of coming up with the THC issues, which will feed in. I think that's enough. I think it shouldn't be, again, this is the issue with the science. It just causes issues. But yeah.
If we diverted the funding from these so-called trade associations who are absolutely silent, you could fund a countrywide surveillance of the consumption of CBD products and provide free school meals to children under the age of 10.
But this is the secret funds that you don't know what it's being used for.
Well, they are. They've been used to make cutting edge, the finest toxicology studies ever. I understand there's a new study ongoing at the moment which will demonstrate that CBD with other cannabinoids is actually safer. And then they'll hand that to the FSA, and the Committee of Toxicity will say, wow, you mean that if you add other cannabinoids to CBD, it reacts differently? Okay, we'll stop the clock on everything. I'd like to know what combination of cannabinoids are present, and I'd like studies on each different combination. I mean, these people, experts, my God.
I'm just going to interrupt there, folks. We are talking about the Canna-Consultants letter asking the FSA to publish guidance on a safety net for products that do breach the ADI at the moment. There is a link in the chat to box for a direction to that. Steve has also mentioned that Mark has done a presentation on the science safety surrounding this recent ADI. That will come up in the chat box as soon as we start asking Mark more questions specifically on that. We do have a couple more questions still left for Steve, though. So, Steve, your statement emphasizes the importance of consumer choice and access to safe products. Can you share your recommendations for creating a policy that allows companies to produce 10 milligram single consumption units whilst maintaining their product's presence on the public list?
Yeah, it's quite simple. I mean, it's an Excel schedule, so I understand the Food Standards Agency are understaffed, and this is not maybe their priority. It's quite simple to actually schedule those products. So you write a letter to each company that has products on the public list. You could say it has to be validated. I don't mind that, or validated and awaiting evidence. That's their decision. And then you allow them to produce an identical product with a reduced amount of CBD. Sign an undertaking that it's manufactured to exactly the same process in the dossier. Sign the same undertaking that it's exactly the same ingredients. And then that would be in addition to the public list, or you amend the public list. Now, we don't want the public list amended to remove the 25 milligram gummy, for example, and replace it, because we think this should be an addition. Or trading standards are able to refer to a list. Now, it's not a difficult process. At the moment, we face a situation where a trading standards officer goes into a high street store and would pick up a 10 milligram. Let's say I reformulate Mark's and Steve's CBD. I reformulate my gummy to 10 milligrams and I put it in the shop. So he picks this up, and our product is on the public list, but it's on the public list at 25 milligrams. He's got one at 10. Now, the reason it's 10 milligrams is because the FSA have advised that an individual consumer unit should not exceed 10 milligrams. So what will he then do? What's his enforcement route from there? He goes back to the office and says, I'd like the shop to remove this product from its shelves because this product has been created by a company going through the novel food application process who has done everything that they've been asked to by the regulatory authority, and they're now trying to comply with consumer advice. But I'm being told that they can only sell product which is contravenes that advice. I may be wrong, but I'm willing to place quite a large wager that does not get to the magistrates' court. So I think one of two things will happen. Either we have a solution such as that, or there is something more grave waiting for us in the wings. And that means that we have a situation where authorization and the public list cannot exist alongside each other. So what are we asking for? We're asking for some clarity. You've given an advisory, which is a policy in orbit name. It was delivered not to the whole of the industry, but ahead of its announcement, it was delivered to retail consortiums. It was delivered to retailers, large retailers. That message has got through, and they are looking for advice. The advice is it's not enforceable. We don't expect you to act at the moment. We're going to give more advice soon. We're thinking about it. It's evident that that is the position they've taken. Put to one side the fact, the conversation we're having and with Mark about how we counter that 10 milligrams, I think that's here to stay until it's countered. And you cannot have a situation where the FSA is producing a list which has products on that which contravene that policy. Advisory.
Anything to add there, Mark?
Yeah, I think the advisory issue is quite an interesting one. And yes, we've got the initial knee-jerk reaction that, yeah, it's not a great thing and should we comply with it? But this is, not the first time. She was sort of aware of that. I can't remember the date now when it first came out. It might have been 2003 or 2005, but we have got a list of vitamins and minerals. I think there's about maybe 8 or 9 advisory warnings for different dosages for vitamins and minerals when they're put in a food supplement, from don't formulate with this dose to things like vitamin B6 causes tingling and potential long-term use results in nerve damage. So we've already been in a position historically where we had advisory statements issued by the government. And what enforcement action do we see over those products? Zero. Absolute zero, at least in the UK, because it's not a legal requirement. It's advisory. A company can decide to stick that on pack, and we advise clients to put that on a food supplement if they exceed those dosages or reformulate. So sometimes it might be a reformulation threshold rather than just a warning. But we don't see products being removed from the market. We see retailers listing products that exceed those dosage levels. Even at a European level, it's not uncommon to get these. We see them all the time from EFSA. So, for example, we've got limits for caffeine, 200 milligrams per day in a single serving, 400 milligrams from all food sources. But we still see, at least on the UK market, products exceeding that. We see other member states deciding that the dose should be lower. So until it becomes law, it's then up for the individual companies to have a pack, basically, to convince a retailer, this is our legal position, and this is why we think X. This is our scientific opinion. And then it's for the enforcement officer and also in correspondence with the FSA to decide what is the chance of this actually going to court and us winning this case? Is there a public interest? And what happens if we actually lose the case? And that's what it'll come down to. And most of the time when you provide a defense for a client, you're trying to put a seed of doubt in the mind of the officer that's deciding that they might or might not enforce against you. And the more evidence that you've got to show, well, okay, on scientific grounds, they're not going to win. And on legal grounds, there's clearly nothing there that makes them have to do this. Then it's a choice. The FSA are going to have to think, okay, and obviously they'll speak to their own lawyers and decide, where are we with this situation? And this is not uncommon. It happens all the time. Lots of occasions where I've had to defend clients over things like this. So at this point, it's quite raw, and industry are visceral and they're worried about what this actually means for them. But we've got time to not apply this to products. It really depends on what your threshold is for risk as a business.
But Mark, it's different, isn't it? Different in that I agree with everything you say. But all of this is happening under the banner of novel foods. Which, if I produce a vitamin B6, I go to Tesco's. They say, right, are you BRC? What's your price point? Are you food safe? Great, we'll take it in. I go with a CBD product and say, are you on the public list? So there's a different gamekeeper for CBD products, and we already know that the margins that the supermarkets, the wholesalers, the basket fees that the resellers want are ridiculously high in comparison to other supplements. So we've got CBD products that should cost the consumer £10-15 and everybody make a nice profit, but they're £40. And that's not the CBD manufacturer that's doing that. It's not the CBD manufacturer that wants to do that. And this public list, unfortunately, is the barrier to entry to Amazon, to Tesco's, to Selfridges, to any of these pathways. We're even seeing now with clients trying to onboard with certain wholesalers in the States that they're asking whether you're on the public list.
But that's separate from the ADI.
Of course it is. But the ADI becomes irrelevant if we don't have an industry. And one of the concerns I have at the moment is the effect of a non-legally binding. I've said myself, I don't think there'll be any enforcement. But if you can't get your products to sell, it's difficult. From a consumer perspective, we've got all of the people currently using CBD, and I accept that if I'm told it's 14 units of alcohol a week, I confess I'm not one to abide by that when I don't want to. If I have a headache, I may take 3 Nurofen. That's fine for all of the existing people, but the CBD industry needs new customers, and the people who have never used CBD before are going to look at that. And a product that you produce, which should last for 30 days, is now going to last for a year. In some cases, I've looked at products and they should have a shelf life of over 5.5 years on them. So there's a commercial aspect to this that I know the FSA don't care about, but as an industry, we've got to try and protect it, because it is having an adverse effect. And I think they know that, and I think it's part of this death by 1,000 cuts. It's a way of concertinaing the industry into a more manageable corral of businesses. And some of the smaller companies.
I totally understand, and I believe that obviously it's a negative effect for industry. But at this point, the issue is going to be, okay, what's the worst harm? Trying to fight your position to say, this is the dose that I want to keep in the product, and this is why. Or to be able to say, right, I'm going to reduce it down to this piss poor 10 milligrams, which is going to do nothing for anyone. A consumer is not going to keep taking a product if it doesn't deliver the claimed effect. The products that do the best are the ones that are products that you can feel. You don't need to use any claims, any marketing. If you take a product and you deliver a claimed effect because they feel it, then that's the benefits. You don't even have to think about health claims. And as soon as you get down to this small amount of dose, you cause issues. And maybe there needs to be a dual pathway for individual companies to think, okay, do I want to sell? What am I going to sell in retail? What's the dosage going to be on the pack? Versus, what am I going to sell, direct, like business to business, direct to consumer. But then you've got the whole issue of, okay, if I put different dosages on there, is that a new product? So, I can just see it just starts becoming a big call. My own view is, is that you should try and defend your position with the dose that you've got in the product. And if the retailer is sensitive to that, so we do a lot of work with Amazon, for example, and we do a lot of work with Boots, Walgreens, and we put a defense in place for clients to say, well, okay, this is outside of CBD. This is what we think is safe. This is the reasons why. And they'll either decide to accept that or not.
I agree with that.
And that's up to industry to make that decision.
This is CBD, isn't it? And CBD it's treated differently by retailers. It's treated differently by the regulators. Anyway, I mean, I think the ADI has a compounding effect on new users of CBD, and I think you're right on the efficacy point. I'm not sure whether 15 milligrams works. I think you probably need a dose of 50 milligrams, and I think it's entirely safe. And I think the people that use it and the people that love CBD understand that, and there'll be no effect to that because they'll just have 5 gummies, or they'll have more drops from the bottle. But for the market to grow, we need the ability to white label, the ability to innovate, and we need to be able to tell consumers the truth about the product, which is that it is safe. Maybe we have a chart on the side so that when I put my weight in, I'm allowed to have 30 milligrams a day. I don't know.
Now, forgive me, I'm just going to interrupt there.
That's a good point for sort of dropper products where, okay, it's 10 milligrams, but it's based on data that's on milligram per kilogram. So, for droppers, it's going to be a lot easier. And that's how a lot of people have got round up for caffeine. That, the product might contain X amount of milligrams of caffeine, but the data that EFSA used was based on 3 milligram per kilogram body weight. But, most people think, oh, well, it's, 200 milligrams, but no one's, or very few people are that light. So, what they say is it's 3 milligram per kilogram body weight. So you actually can do the health claim as well. That's associated with that. So maybe that's an option for at least some products, but obviously other ones, it's a lot more difficult.
Now, I just want to apologise to any viewers who, like me, are young and impressionable. Yes, Mark did say a naughty word, but I don't think he meant it in any way. So basically, apologies. However, we've got one last question for Stephen, and then we will be talking to Mark specifically about an article that he was featured in the last couple of days, focusing on the ADI and his opinions. So, Steve, Now, we've kind of had a little bit of clarification. There was a little bit of uncertainty, but the FSA have stated that whilst that ADI was derived from tox reports for isolate and all synthetic, it actually applies across all products. The industry appears to be in a challenging position, caught between complying with the FSA's conservative 10 milligram advice and maintaining regulatory compliance. How can industry stakeholders collectively address this issue and advocate for a more balanced approach to CBD regulation in the UK?
Well, not via the APPG or a trade association, I would say. I think by getting good advice. I mean, this is free advice. I think there's got to be a change. I think we now know. You know, let's be honest. I haven't got the bat phone. Paul Tossell doesn't pick his phone up. Paul Tossell probably thinks, Christ, it's Steve Oliver again when I get hold of him. But I have a dialogue, you know. Just let's stop believing that these people have got these relationships. It's regulated. They've got a responsibility. We are in the dark to a certain extent. Some of us are better at crystal ball gazing than others. But let's be quite clear. If you continue to have your mum mark your homework and pay for her to mark it at the moment, the future's not bright. We have got a battle ahead of us. And the battle is to make sure that we have a CBD industry. Once we have an established CBD industry, the focus will turn elsewhere, and then we can move to other products and innovation, bioavailability, and move across broad spectrum and hopefully full spectrum products. So I think, what do we need to do? I think we need to be very honest. I think we need to hear the answers to questions that we don't want to hear. And I think we need to start asking questions. So I think we need to start asking, what does that toxicology work contain? Where's the data? We pay for the data, collectively share the data. I think we need to look at the scientific point. There are scientists out there and the people like Mark that can analyse this work, and we look at it and we know it's flawed. But at the moment, we can't challenge it because the FSA haven't given us the detail in order for us to be able to challenge it. Mark made a very good point. If I sent a document into the FSA with all of these statements and no footnotes and no references, they come back. EFSA asked me to include every single publication I refer to in full. So you're going through Wiley and everywhere, paying £200, £150. The FSA want chapter and verse. The link's got to work. They need to abide by their own standards. So they need to be transparent. Before I say challenge the validity of the decision, we need to see the information upon which the decision was based. And then I think with some more transparency in the industry and people actually disclosing counter information, we can put together a concerted response. At the moment, I would urge people to dig in. I do think it's important that we can remain compliant in the eyes of retailers. And that's why I think it's important that we are allowed to change and add to the public list. And I fully agree with Mark. We need to see how they made their decision. And I think we need to be able to do that and then respond to it. That we can see the flaws in the methodology, but without the actual numbers, it's very difficult to tell them that they got their maths wrong.
What about you, Mark?
I've got nothing to add to that one. I mean, I think Steve's, summed everything up there.
Excellent. Although, as knowledgeable as he is, he did mention Vulcan cloaking devices earlier, but, obviously not everyone can be a Star Trek fan.
Hang on, isn't it?
And Romulan. You were nearly there.
Romulan, okay. Yeah.
So let's move on. Okay, Mark, now you were in a NutraIngredient article recently that basically called for people to challenge, acquiesce against the FSA's advice. So I've got some questions for you here, sir. The link to that article is now in the chat box for anyone who is watching. And let's start. Right, the recent change in the FSA's recommended daily dose for CBD, lowering it to 10 milligram per day, has raised concerns and sparked discussions within industry. What is your perspective on the information used? I know we've kind of touched on this already, before we've got to this point, but do you think there is enough information for the FSA to legitimately make their opinions felt on this, or do you think that they're hiding away from information that could really pull into question this ADI?
I don't think it's not so much the FSA that's hiding away. I mean, it's the scientific committees that are not providing enough data for us to provide a full analysis. But even on what they have said, there's a number of concerns with the robustness of the data, and the way they've ignored other data. So, at minimum, it should be transparent, so we can actually provide a detailed analysis of what they've put in the report. But yeah, I mean, we've raised obviously already some of the issues that are there. But I mean, the only thing that's really sort of changed in my view from sort of 2020 till now is we've got those 3 individual studies, but we're provided almost no information about that. And all of the other things that have been raised up in the report outside of vulnerable groups, most of them can be resolved through labelling issues, which have been accepted historically for lots of other novel foods. I don't know why we keep going back to things like, things like drug interventions, for example, which is like if you take a drug like warfarin and you're drinking your grapefruit juice, well, not grapefruit juice, but Aloha, for example, which increases bleeding times. Do you need a medical warning saying don't drink your grapefruit juice, or you might end up with increased bleeding time? We're not going to see that on a grapefruit. It's a lot of it's quite unusual. Could easily be resolved with, don't use if you're on medication. Don't use this if you're ill. A lot of the things can be resolved, which leaves you only a few, relatively small issues, like reprotox data, which can be dealt with, like I said, we've seen the studies now from Rita Henderson, offer alternative ADIs for what the scientific committees have suggested. So I do think there's room there to give us a different ADI. But if not, and they've got some special evidence that we've not seen in the report, then that should be brought forward to convince someone like me, okay, well, 10 milligrams is what we should have.
And on that, I've mentioned earlier that the FSA, whilst stating that this is from tox data for isolate and synthetic CBD, and the fact that there are 3 categories of applications, they've still gone on to say that this ADI applies across the board. Now, do you think that that's sensible, or do you think that there's an adequate argument for each category to have its own ADI?
I think there should be separate categories, and I mean, ultimately, the position paper from the scientific committees were really straightforward. It said this only applies to Group A, so the 98% and above group of submissions. Or 98% CBD and above that are placed on the market. So anything outside of that, well, they've not done the scientific assessment. So the FSA have just decided to add that in themselves based on what rationale. Now, on the science side, the first 2 studies that ever came out that were full, well-constructed toxicology studies, we had one by Marks and we had one by Deswinka. Totally different types of extracts, they weren't isolates. But when you actually looked at the amount of CBD that was there at the point of departure, so when it became toxic, they were both exactly 17.5 milligrams, even though they had a completely different composition, which suggests maybe it's the actual CBD is the toxic bit. But then we've had more data in 2023 that shows that when you provide CBD in addition to THC, it actually increases the absorption of CBD. So maybe that's the actual basis of the entourage effect, but you could also say that's the basis for more accumulation in the body, being more bioavailable when it's provided with other parts of the hemp plant. So based on that alone, these other groups, Group B and Group C products, should have their own assessment for their ADIs. You can't clump them together because we know these other compounds have their own toxicological effects.
If you'd like to add anything to that, Steve?
Yeah, I agree. I just want to get a cup of tea. I think that the issue here goes back to, again, I keep mentioning trade associations. I think people know the one I'm talking about, but trying to shoehorn everything into one thing. Novel foods is about, an ingredient. We're talking about a single compound here. If we wanted to talk about an ingredient that contained other cannabinoids, then we would have to have a specification for it, and we haven't got one. And they're trying to one size fits all. So I can see the pathway through for the regulators with CBD, and I think the points that Mark's made there just tell me that the only way that you can proceed with a compound which has an ingredient which, my apologies, has multiple compounds in it, which are active ingredients, and are claimed to have antibiotic effects, anti-inflammatory effects, and react differently together. That's red rag to a bull for somebody looking at potential toxicity. So I think they're running towards a dead end there, which is why I think we need to concentrate and consolidate on the CBD industry. And it's called the CBD industry rather than the cannabis extract industry for a reason, is because there's a pathway through the woods. Once we get through, we can drag the other ones with us. And I think, going back to a point that was raised earlier, that surveillance of the consuming population is going to be incredibly helpful there. And we talked to brands recently about engaging with their customers to start to collect data, to actively encourage anybody to tell you if they've had adverse effects. I mean, we're not hearing of any, but I think we need to be preemptive. But yeah, I don't see a situation where the regulators are going to force us to jump through that many hoops for a single compound and then say an amalgamation at an undetermined level or ratio can follow. It's just not going to happen. And anybody that's telling people that is selling them a lie, unfortunately.
Well, Mark, next question, sir. The FSA recently indicated that the new ADI may impact the public list. How do you foresee this change affecting products currently on the market and either awaiting authorization or for those products on the public list still labeled as awaiting evidence?
Jesus, that was a difficult one. Yeah, I think it's only one bit of evidence. It's only one bit of analysis, and they'll just consider, okay, we've come up with an ADI. We think, okay, anything that's got 10 milligrams or above, these other issues could be raised. Potentially any products that are on the list that have come up with a point of departure below 10 milligrams, they're more likely to have an easy ride through. But I find it unusual that we've only got 3 companies at this point that have got through to the point where they think, okay, they've got enough data. Why is that? Given the fact that the trade associations have got thousands of members that have all got their own dossiers, it just seems quite strange. Why have we only got 3 data points to look at after all these years? So I think it's only going to be used as a little barometer to say, okay, well, maybe you need to think about this a bit more carefully once it gets above 10 milligrams. But outside of that, I don't, like I said, if we had a new client and we were submitting a dossier, it wouldn't really feed into anything because it doesn't tell you anything, which has been a big chunk of our discussion. It's a view, it's a commentary on the science, but they don't tell you what the science is. So unless we know what the science is, you can only pick the words out and try and guess what they're saying. Immunosuppression. Well, okay, what dose, in what population, were they on medication? What is the indicator of immunosuppression? What was the marker for that? Is immunosuppression always a bad thing? You have a range of what's a normal range. Well, if that's normal and you go from there and you're still in the normal range. You've suppressed the immune system, but you've not moved outside the normal range. But maybe that's why CBD works. We talk about it being an anti-inflammatory. Well, if it's only moving within the normal range, it's not delivering a pharmacological effect. Maybe it's just delivering a nutritional effect, like eating some turmeric. So yes, you've suppressed the immune system, but only to the degree that it would have been super physiological if the inflammation markers went beyond that. So until we know the data, these words that they use that sound scary and sound like, oh, they're having a big toxicological effect really don't mean much at all.
Steve, I want to throw a question at you on this.
Can I just add one to that, Kevin?
Oh, go on then.
Yeah, to that point, because I think, Mark touched on the immunosuppressant and that. I mean, they've got this, they're trying to tell couples who are trying to conceive now. I mean, I have to cast. I'm a grandfather now. I have to cast my mind back, but it can be fairly sort of anxious and agitating having to, stick to the timetable and perform. And I think potentially CBD could be an aid to couples trying to conceive, to reduce that anxiety and allow nature to move forward. So, yeah, I disagree with
problems.
No. I'm not saying that. A friend of mine did.
That's it.
We are hitting on a recurring theme here, though, obviously, with the lack of visible or scrutinizable data. And considering the question was asked, what stakeholders can do, is there possibly an argument for us to say, come on, let's not be shy. Many companies are at risk here. Show your data. Because if all of the data for all the tox reports was just put on the table, then surely the FSA wouldn't be able to ignore the fact that we can all see what they're adjudicating.
I bet Steve's thinking what I'm thinking. If we get all of the publications from the Trade Association, we'll have an absolute cave-in from the actual well-constructed studies. But yeah, I mean, my general view is that it's really rare, even though we've done it now for one of the clients. We've published the full toxicology data. Well, not all of it, but it will be by next month. We've published at least the 90-day studies, for example, and some of the pharmacokinetic stuff. You wouldn't do that as part of a novel food submission. You want proprietary data. You don't want to tell everyone else what you're doing, piggybacking off your work. But in that instance, and it's the first time that we've ever done it in all the applications we've done, there's specific policy reasons for doing that. For example, if you're selling in the US, they won't look at anything unless it's publicly accessible data. And that's why other American tox people have done the same. But outside of that, you normally don't want to disclose things. You have to be very careful about what you disclose because you want proprietary protection. You might have IP that's ongoing through patents. There's lots of things. So you have to jump through a lot of hoops before you decide what's going to go into those submissions. So yes, people might, it might be useful, but it's definitely not a recommended process. Even though we went down that route, it's definitely not something that I would suggest is normal or something that I would recommend for companies, unless there's a specific way to protect key information.
We could get everyone to release the key data, putting aside the fact that we think that there might be a trade association there that has got some relatively unhelpful data that may have led to this conversation in the first place, but then we know there are a lot of competent studies. We could take 2 or 3 key data points, and that would give us an overview of the data that we know is sitting with the FSA, and that might be an invitation for them to disclose 2 things: the data that they're relying on, and the reason they've excluded these other in their consideration.
But I want to flip this around a second, because as annoying as that 10 milligram figure is, I think I must have got slapped in my sleep from Kirsty last night for muttering probably 10 milligram. We are really at a starting point of movement, really, aren't we? Because we can't go forward without that ultimately, and the recognition that this is the we're at the door of products being authorized. So we can't really paint this entirely in a bad light, can we? There is some silver lining to the cloud, as it was.
I don't know. See, I think the Home Office letter was the one we were waiting for. So that was what was stopping authorizations. The ADI is a sideshow, if you like, and I agree with Mark. It should be treated individually on the ingredient. I don't think it will be, unfortunately. But the Home Office letter opens up the FSA's ability to authorize products in the absence of the legislation that's required. Because by accepting that 50 micrograms of Delta-9 would be a level that could be permitted in a single dose, we don't need them to go further and tell us how that affects a product. We don't need them to change the law, because that means that isolates can go through, because the isolates are never going to breach that level. So the 97, the 90, I agree with Mark, 97 is ridiculous if it's high purity, because you've got plus or minus 5% anyway. So let's talk about well-made CBD isolates. They can go through this process along with your synthetics because they're never going to get anywhere near on a consumer unit this level. I don't suspect the Home Office will square this circle and change the legislation for some time. But that is the green light for authorizations. But it's authorizations for highly purified CBD and CBD only. What it doesn't address is that it blocks off the 3 limbs. So it demonstrates that, the 3-limb test cannot apply to consumer products. But what it doesn't do is what we would have liked is we had as well as research and medical use, we would have wanted and authorized CBD products, because then a manufacturer could have a license, and then a manufacturer could lawfully hold 1,000 liters of CBD isolate or 1,000 kilos, which would mean that the combined mass was a narcotic, but it was licensed. And as long as they had the security protocols in place, and as long as they could prove that their consumer unit abided by the FSA's authorization process, then we have an industry in the UK, because people will buy a tincture. The consumer will use more. I think they've constricted the market, but you're right, Kevin. I think there is good news in here, because some of us always suspected that this would be wrenched away by the MHRA, or that this was just going to be the preserve of your Jazz, your GW, now your Jazz. Sorry. Now that may be the case. I mean, what we've been telling them for 10 years. I think 2013 was the first time, the Charlotte, the girl that led to Charlotte's Web, and then we had Professor Sanjay Gunjup when he was in 2013. So we've known since then CBD has these benefits, and that's why consumers want it, because they couldn't get their hands on it. So they understand that we were right, and I think pharmaceutical companies with their patents and investment would like to keep hold of that. So I suspect the industry, the supplement industry, will be at a low level. Now, Mark made a point earlier that you take that nothing happens. So consumers won't use a product that, if you like strong B, you don't buy 2%. But I think you will find people that can readily access CBD. The price will come down for the consumer, and they will use more than the recommended amount. So I think there is a win. Again, talk about this forest. There's a way through.
Nice. Anything from you there, Mark?
Probably a question for Steve. So in the sort of opinion on the THC limits, it uses terminology like the dose of each controlled cannabinoid. So you can comment on this or not, and you can keep this for consultancy, but I haven't got an opinion at this point. But does that mean it's 50 micrograms per controlled cannabinoid? Because unlike other member states in Europe, we've got maybe, I think it's 10 or 11 controlled cannabinoids. That's different from if they're talking about 50 micrograms for each controlled cannabinoid versus 50 micrograms for all controlled cannabinoids. And that seems to be quite unusual. The wording that it doesn't.
It's non-committal, isn't it?
Yeah. There's a few things in there, but that's a big one.
Can I just interject before you answer that question, Steve? Because I could have sworn, in regards to what Mark's just said, that I went through some kind of Mandela effect, because I thought the original ACMD guidance suggested that it was 50 micrograms combined per serving, but then when the Home Office released their document, it was like, hold on, per cannabinoid. I did go back and obviously double check, and it was like, all cannabinoids, or 50 micrograms from all controlled cannabinoids, as well as THCA, which isn't controlled, but it's deemed with suspicion. But I feel Mark's got something here. There wasn't. It didn't seem clear.
Well, that's why we've not been championing this letter. It's more questions than answers. So there are 12 controlled cannabinoids in the UK. My understanding is, and someone here may correct me if I'm wrong, I am not aware of anybody that can test more than 5 of those. So we have 12 controlled cannabinoids, of which we can only test 5, and the Police and Home Office, if they're looking to prosecute you, will not test for more than 5, and in fact they're only looking for 2. And our 2 controlled cannabinoids essentially are THC and CBN, and as Mark rightly said, CBN is not controlled anywhere else in Europe, apart from, I think, Liechtenstein at the moment. So, yeah. Before we get to whether it's for all of those, and whether it's for 12 of those that we can't, 7 that we can't test for, or the 5 that we can test for. I think the bigger question is, the Home Office have rightly identified that the ACMD missed the whole point when they targeted in on the dose or the serving. They missed the consumer unit, because the Home Office's position here is somebody that wants to abuse controlled drugs is not going to take 5 drops. They're going to buy the bottle and they're going to neck it. And if they can get high, that has to be protected. So we are no closer to answering this question. What we have done is given a green light to the FSA to authorise the current position, which is 0 controlled cannabinoids. Now, they're talking about analytical testing. That needs to be done. We've had a ring study. I don't know why we need another one.
Yeah.
But I'm sure we'll have another one. You know, they are now saying that should be, done by, the DSTL. So that, why they do that after 2 years, I just don't get it. I mean, they don't answer the questions. The ACMD were posed questions. And in fairness, the Home Office, if you look back to the questions that the Home Office asked the ACMD to answer, the ACMD thought, you know what, they're a bit difficult. Let's answer the easy ones. So the responses that we got back are in response to the easy questions to answer. And there's an absence. We still don't know. How are you going to control this? So is it going to be, are we going to test for which cannabinoids are we going to test for? Because there was an inference there that they weren't too worried about CBN, if you remember, in the ACMD response. So they were just focusing on Delta-9. So which ones are we going to test for? How are we going to test for them? And what are we going to test? And if we're testing a consumer product, then surely it's got to be the combined contents of that, the consumer available consumption unit, rather than the recommended dose. And I would put that to the backdrop. We're trying to control sugar and alcohol units now. I cannot see them allowing somebody to produce a litre bottle of CBD that would get the 3 of us off our trolleys and trust the consumer just to have a pipette full. So I think it raises more questions. But what I do think is it's the document that the FSA needed to move forward, because they know that the products they authorise are never going to breach this accepted level of 50 micrograms. By the way, I've seen people discussing that as 50 milligrams. So that's very important that people understand one's a thousandth and one's a millionth of a gram. But if you just think about it simply, you've got a 10 ml bottle. So you've got 10,000 milligrams. We still have people perpetuating you can have 0.2% THC. So if you've got 0.2% of THC in a 10,000 milligram, that would give you 200 milligrams of controlled cannabinoid. That is never going to happen. And if that did happen, apropos the 10 milligrams ADI, then you have to ratchet that down, and then you're going to have somewhere in the region of 400 doses within a single 10 ml bottle. So there needs to be a lot of thought. And I think when the Home Office say the specificity of the terms of legislative provisions setting the unit of consumption, brackets or serving for the permitted dose, which will differ between products, will require further careful consideration. Bearing in mind, and I might have my dates wrong, the ACMD wrote to the Home Office in 2001, December. We got the response October 2003, and they obviously gave that careful consideration. Careful consideration at the moment is somewhere around about 30 months. So I am waiting with bated breath for the results of Steve Moore and the ACI's meetings that they've had this week with the Home Office to tell us what the legislative plans are to implement this.
We do actually have a question in the box in regards to the ACI. Folks, we do have one last question for Mark before we go into a Q&A, and then we do look a little bit closer into the ACMD suggestions. Feel free to jump onto the comment section and leave any questions. We'll hopefully get through a good 3, 4 or 5. We've only got one at the moment. And like I said, it mentions the ACI, but then, they've already been mentioned today. All right, Steve, he's been stalking me on LinkedIn, just a weird one. But anyway, last one for you, Mark. The FSA initially stated that the current ADI is not legally binding, but rather a view. But now we are seeing that there are discussions that will look at the function of the public list, presumably on the basis of the ADI. How can the industry work together to ensure that the FSA is aware of that additional data and studies available? Now, we have touched on this. Whether it's people sharing their tox data, but you were a little bit more specific in that article that is now in the chat box.
You'll have to remind me. I'm on.
I will read the headline for you, sir.
They just need to write to the FSA and just say, look, these are the studies. I provided a presentation on the science and the issues, and even just at a basic level of them saying, here's a link to this presentation. Why did the committee not review the Henderson work, the publication from Tallon, the publication from Law? Why have you accepted 70 milligrams in the past when it was suggested to be 4, and now you are accepting the full recommendations of the committee? Please, can you have the committee reassess with this new science for the point of departure? It's that simple in terms of trying to push something back, but they can just ignore these requests ultimately. But I think the more that it's in the public, the more that it's in trade press, the more pressure there'll be to actually answer these questions, to provide a response, to be able to say, okay, we feel he is an obligation because he is in law, for them to assess the most latest science, when they're coming up with this guidance. So there needs to be pressure, but everyone needs to provide the pressure, and it needs to be open. So, let the trade associations have an open letter. Let's see what their toxicologists have got to say about this stuff, and let them present like we've presented now for free, to the industry, to say these are the issues that are affecting us and what's coming down the track. Let the trade associations, they're getting the big cash. Let them do a public letter. Let them do a presentation with data. And send that openly, to industry publications as well as the FSA, and force an answer to say, okay, we're going to reassess the science before the ADI ends up becoming more than just guidance.
Mm-hmm. I'd only add one thing to that. One further question for the FSA, which again, as Mark says, don't have to answer. How many other studies are they in possession of as of today that they haven't included in this assessment? Because there are numerous studies. There are people that have made applications and studies that were available to the FSA prior to the Committee on Toxicity conducting this research with the ACNFP, and there are studies that have come in subsequently. So it would be, if we don't have that transparency for the industry, and I fully appreciate why people would want to keep hold of that proprietary data and not necessarily declare the fact as to what they've submitted, but the FSA should be able to tell us how much information that they've had, in order for us to see, well, why have you only looked at those 3 studies?
The other thing I would say is the opinion now that we've got from the government on the ACMD, guidance or suggestions, is how will that impact the novel food submissions? So yes, many people might be under the 50 microgram levels, but maybe it's when you add the controlled cannabinoids together, maybe they're not. And then the issue is, okay, well, if the business says, well, we can move them out, we can, change our extraction purification methods, what does that mean to the novel foods data? Because then you've got something that may not have the same level of toxicity.
Be a new ingredient, Mark, wouldn't it? I mean, that would.
Well, it's not what was assessed during the study. So the question is then, where does that fit? Obviously, if it's like they've said, and it's the dose of each controlled cannabinoid, because if you've got 12 controlled cannabinoids, you take 10, a couple of milligrams X times, 10 times a day, you end up with like 6,000 milligrams of controlled cannabinoids before you know it. So that's not going to be a problem. But if the total amount is the 50 micrograms, that might have quite big implications for the novel foods that have been submitted. And if I was involved in that process with people, that's what I'd be discussing with the client. Okay, well, what does that actually mean to what we submitted? And then it's going to be a debate about, okay, what if you got 60 micrograms in? And then the issue is, okay, well, all right, the way we resolve that is we'll split the dose in half. We'll give X milligrams on the morning and X milligrams in the second dose because the restriction is per serving. Yeah. Well, that's not what you give in the study. You give the rat 1 dose daily by oral gavage. Well, you're going to have a different bioavailability curve if you give it 2 servings a day, which is going to change your toxicology profile. So I can see lots of potential issues there with that advice to where it's actually going to link. So yes, it could be great for the companies that have got below that 50 microgram threshold, if that is what the threshold becomes. But those over that, then it's going to be a discussion, potentially even the development of a bridging study to show there's no difference between 50 and 60 micrograms or 50 and 200 micrograms, whatever the level is.
I think if they accepted that as a level and that was safe, I don't think they would accept it above, because then you've got the food law moves to one side and the controlled drugs takes precedence. So I think what would happen is, say for example, they need to square the circle and say, right, in a 10 ml tincture, it can have no more than 1 milligram of combined controlled cannabinoids, of which there are 5 we test, and that means that there would be a maximum of there could be 40 doses in that 10 ml bottle, and each of those doses would contain less than 25 micrograms of controlled cannabinoids combined. That's a pragmatic approach, but we're not there yet, because the Home Office you would imagine the way the advisory process works is the Home Office will now give careful consideration to this, come up with a proposal about how they are going to deal with dose, product, unit, send that back to the ACMD, who will then consider that and provide the advice based on that, because they've accepted a recommendation which isn't complete, which is why I don't think this is going to happen quickly. And at the moment, it's zero.
I mean, the other issue is, I don't know about you, but when we submitted our dossiers, we didn't get a letter back, a validation saying, this might not be a food, it could be a narcotic,
No.
But we'll accept it. The issue is for validation, the checks are, is it a food or is it a narcotic? Is it a medicine or something else falls out of the Article 2 definition of general food law of what a food is? And we never got told anything about that, the same as other clients. So now to say, well, okay, we accepted it as a food, you spent all the money, all the time, but now we're saying to you, it's a narcotic, and all of that work doesn't mean anything. Now, the legal position of that, again, is quite interesting.
It's tenuous, I think, because the premise, the foundation is built on an unlawful product. So the risk is always with you. I think we've seen that to a certain extent because there has been some removal of products on the public list. So we've seen, the doggy bites come off. We've seen some products which got through. A lot of that happened before validation, but you're quite right now, looking at the public list. And this is the problem with the consortium approach when you've got these huge waves of products. I suspect what happened was the consortium, some of them didn't actually put the detail of the actual product. So people thought they were buying a license or paying a fee to be included on a dossier, but there wasn't actually any detail there. So when you get to the risk assessment phase, they'll look at this product, you would imagine, and say, okay, what stability do you have for this? What degradation do you have? Have you looked at the nutritional value? There'd be a lacuna, there'd be an absence of any data. And what the dossier owner will be relying on is that they've done that on a selection of products, and it's whether or not they'll cascade down and the FSA will allow that to happen. It would appear that's going to be problematic if you have to prove the absence of controlled cannabinoids to a highly accurate level. Because an HPLC machine is not going to be sufficient to start looking at 50 micrograms of either one of 5 individual controlled cannabinoids. A lot of them don't test for 5 controlled cannabinoids. A lot of them don't test for more than 12 cannabinoids in total. So I think one of the things we're going to see is a whole raft of new testing. I think we're going to see a requirement for authorization to meet that new standard that's talking about, because that's a fairly easy thing to implement. And the standard of COAs that we've all seen over the last few years is I've always said it shouldn't say ND not detected. It should say not bloody looked for. It should be NBL. I've changed the bloody from another word, Kevin, so that I don't get told off.
Right, gentlemen, I have to be conscious of the time. Now, I do have a few more questions to ask. I'm going to have to ditch some because, yeah, we've nearly been going on for 2 hours. I was going to do a joint Q&A.
5 minutes.
But 5 minutes?
75 minutes.
Okay, right. I'll tell you what, the one question that I do want to touch on, right, is basically where do GW lab reports go? Now, I was on an ACI webinar at the beginning of this year, and basically one of their tox specialist, Dr. Paul Duffy, literally turned around and said, well, you know, our lab reports, as well as others, are kind of reflecting that 70 milligram ADI derived from GW lab reports. Now, we've got the free lab reports here that have given us the 10 milligram, but we're being told that there wasn't sufficient enough data from the GW lab reports for them to really have a footing. I mean, yes, they are for a pharmaceutical product, not a food, but surely they still have relevance considering they basically were there from the start of the process until 5 minutes ago.
There's a lot more of that data available than the FSA would have said. I think the FSA made a request at the end of 2019, early 2020 to GW to provide all of the data, and it was refused. That's the absolute right. But I think when you go to the FDA and you can access a lot of data. When you analyse that data, there's absolute justification for the 70 milligrams a day and much higher. But you know their default position has always been that was based on a risk versus reward, and it was apropos the benefit to someone's health as a medicine to the risk to their health. That's not the way the data is presented. It's not the way any of the data is analysed. It's not the way any of the research was conducted. You know, we weren't looking at rats with existing conditions. The poor Wistar rat that GW dispatched many years ago is exactly the same Wistar rat that was dispatched recently by other companies. You know, the chimpanzee, the horse. You know, I mean, I can remember one CBD company telling us that proudly that they've been through 9 species. None of this. They didn't go out and select horses with epilepsy or people on other medication. It's an absolute joke, in my opinion. The data that exists supports a safe level above 70 milligrams. Mark was talking about data, and I'm aware of data. Even if you provide the very strange levels and the additional multiple, reduction of 3, we're still coming out at 50 to 55 milligrams. Where we're looking at the 70, we've got 235. All of the data that I'm seeing that has been done professionally, GLP standard, with people that know what they're doing, is consistent. The levels are different, but they're all consistent that it's higher than 70 milligrams per day. GW provided us with a huge amount of data. The FSA were the people that made the decision that we couldn't use that data because it was for medicinal use.
You any thoughts on that, Mark?
Well, I mean, Steve knows. I mean, I've always seen zero value in the Epidiolex data. Every product is individual. Yes, if you do a well-constructed novel food submission, you do a PRISMA review and you look at the available data and you find out what the data gaps were. But the fact is the GW data is not available. If you ask for the raw data, you can't get it. So you're looking at a summary of what the data may mean rather than individual values, which is really what you're trying to do. You want to look at a much more detailed view. Some of it is good in terms of giving you indications what you might do to design a study where there might be some issues. But much of the stuff, the doses, again, it's super physiological. It's not what we're looking for food because it's designed for medicine. And we've seen the mess of that when someone uses a medicalized design for novel foods. You end up with a tiny bit at the bottom and then a massive data spread with some points at the top. And that's why I keep saying toxicology for medicine is not toxicology for food. But hey, That
Who could you possibly be referring to?
Yeah. Anyway, but yes, I don't think the GW data is that useful. And I think again, it's when you look at the opinion here, that's been given from the scientific committees, you can't just say, well, GW said X. It's just a nonsense. You need to give us the actual data. What shows the 5 milligrams? Was it in healthy subjects? Was it in the rats? Whether using concomitant medication at the same time, had they been on medication and then had some time off? There's just so much stuff that you're just not aware of what's going on there. You can't look at that level of detail, and you're trying to provide some certainty to the regulator about the quality, the control of design, and it's relevant for a food product is what it comes back to. How is this relevant for foods? And yes, it may be toxic when you get to 300 or 500 milligrams, but how is that relevant when we're suggesting a dose of maybe 50 milligrams or something around that type of area? So yes, the GW stuff's interesting, but I just don't see it as that relevant for the dossiers. If you've invested in the science, you've paid for your studies, it should stand or fall in the data of those studies. It's only useful then when you come into arguments, if you get a stop clock and they come back and they say, well, we think that it might mean this. And what about this study from, before my grandfather was born and, this was a monkey and we did this to them, then you might want to look at some other data to say, well, it wasn't relevant here. It's not relevant here, but this is, more well-structured data that's relevant to the dose that we've got in the product. That's the only place it sort of fits in terms of those type of discussions. But in terms of, I know lots of dossiers that were basically constructed round about just the Epidiolex data. And anyone who's done one of these, that the Epidiolex stuff, you can't do that. You can't just pinch something and say, well, that's ours. Never mind the IP, issues of using all that data has been the vast thing that tries to get an approval. So yes, I think it's useful in terms of some discussions there, but it shouldn't be what makes or breaks a dossier.
No, I think it was justification to prevent the wholesale animal testing that took place. And I think what the COP could have done, having had sight of that data, is identified more clearly and asked for a single study and maybe taken responsibility for that.
I 100% agree with that. And the same with EFSA. They waited until everyone spent a fortune, submitted all the dossiers, and you had hundreds of dossiers going in. I don't know how many had individual studies, but even if we just say there's 30, that is a lot of cash. And then it was like, because I remember being on the EFSA call and I said to EFSA about that. Now you're saying to us, think about a consortium approach. After 19 companies have already done the submissions, you knew we had exactly the same data, you knew exactly the same stuff when there was a call for evidence. Why didn't you suggest that then? Too late. And thousands of animals are deaths against the 3R approach for studies. And we could have said, use the GW data, exactly like you said. This is where we think there might be some toxicity issues. Let's design a study. Industry, puts money in a pot, follows the design that's agreed by the FSA and EFSA. Boom, we've got at least a starting point. And if people want to diverge from that, they can pay for their own studies.
Yeah.
Nice. I'll just put that question in context for a few people. Obviously, in that webinar, I raised a question on why that data was reflecting Epidiolex data. I said after January 2019, in February of that year, we had the World Health Organization release data that suggested that people could eat or consume between 2,400 milligrams a day with no effect. Now, I asked why we weren't seeing any lab reports coming back that reflected that data. Now, the head of Novel Foods, Paul Tossell, was on that call and he replied directly to that. And he said it was because that data reflected pharmaceutical data and not food data. Of course, at that time, my first thought was, hold on, we got 16 GW lab reports, and I'm pretty certain they don't reflect food data. But then, of course, at the end of the day, we did need something to get started, because if we didn't have that, and it's a bit of a hypothetical question here, if we didn't have GW pharmaceutical data at the beginning, how much more of a rocky road do you think novel foods for CBD products would have been?
I don't think it would have been any more rocky, to be honest with you.
No?
I think it formed a template that people wrongly followed, and I think the regulators allowed people and possibly encouraged people to follow it. It goes back to Mark's answer. We both agree on this. There was a huge amount of unnecessary animal testing that was what should have happened at that stage, and we questioned it at the time, and it fell on deaf ears, and we had very aggressive responses from the COP, and the trade associations never questioned that. That was their role at the time as a consortium rather than a money machine, to do exactly what Mark and I discussed at the time, and what Mark's just reiterated there, which was a single study to address the concerns. That's the way it should have happened. It went directly against their policy of the 3 R's, which is the replicate reduction of animal testing. It hasn't happened in any other industry. With other novel foods, we see with duckweed recently, an ability to analyse other data, no requirement for animal testing. They're actually referring to that in this rather disingenuously, that there's no point doing animal testing because humans behave differently. I mean, I'm banging my bloody head against the table. My opinion is, had we not had them, we may have had an entirely different approach, Kevin. I'm interested to hear what Mark thinks.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it was just it created confusion because obviously a lot of people that entered the CBD industry had no idea about the cost of a novel food submission. And when they found out how expensive it was going to be, they basically looked for any consultant that would say, we'll do it for you, give us 40 grand and we'll do a submission for you based on just the Epidiolex data. And with the amount of people that we turned away because we said that's going to fail and we value a reputation is unbelievable. But people were happy to do that because they felt this is a deal. These guys are saying 40 grand. They can do the study. They can do a submission based on the Epidiolex. And I'll tell you, it was everyone knew that these were going to fail. But it just created that false sense of security for industry for that period to think, oh, we don't need to spend, hundreds of thousands on a true toxicity study. But I'd say no lessons have really been learned since then, because EFSA are still asking for, these excessive 2 generational studies. And even if you just look, one of these studies, you might be looking at 4,000 dead rats. Okay. You extend that to the 19 applicants, you're looking at 250,000 dead animals if every one of those companies decide to do that study. And why is it ridiculous? Well, if you look at Rieta Henderson's paper, if you use just her data, and there's a study that's looked at the type of study that she's done, and equivalent studies, screening studies like that, and then they've compared it against the outcomes of the type of study that EFSA are asking for, and you know how many cases of reproductive toxicity you miss out on? 3%. There's a 3% chance of that data not showing what you'd find by killing 4,000 other rats. Now, for me, it's a risk reduction exercise. Why are we on the 3% chance of us finding something from doing those studies? They're going to make us do that with animals. That to me tells me it's not a science issue, it's a policy issue. They don't want CBD on the market, and that's what they're trying to put in place as a roadblock. But again, where's the trade associations arguing that exact point? Where's that exact point that, okay, we know that study proves X, and by spending all that cash, it's going to do nothing. There's a 3% chance that we might pick up additional developmental issues, which can be resolved by just saying, if you're looking to conceive, or you're pregnant or lactating, don't use this product. Boom. Don't have to spend a penny. Let the applications go forwards. No company is going to spend £1 million on that study.
And they also want human data, which is ethically, morally, and legally unobtainable, because you can't possibly look at the drug-drug interaction. You can't possibly try and induce an adverse reaction in somebody. how we're going to look at the causes of diarrhea. It's just it's ridiculous. But anyway, we could talk about that for ages. So I think in a nutshell, we probably both think that the absence of the GW data would have not had a negative effect.
Okay, that's an interesting thing. I thought it might have gone the other way, but really nice, well put opinions there. Now, again, I'm still conscious of the time, so let's do a little look at the chat box. Now, I've got to be honest, we've only got 2 questions. I'll save the ACI one for last and go with Ben01. Thanks very much for laying a question on for us, sir. How does this news affect all the non-food full spectrum products which are sold openly and commonly contain 0.2% overall controlled cannabinoids by volume, whether they be with 10 milligram, 50 milligram, or 100 milligram? Now, yes, and that's just followed up with apologies. That's not related to food, but yes, I think good call there, Benno, because I feel that Steve might have just jumped in and said, forget 0.2% THC. But Steve, what's your opinion, sir?
So I'm assuming he means food supplements then, yeah?
He did ask that question, and then he followed up with apologies. It's not related to food. So I'm a little bit uncertain. Is there any medicinal products out there that fit that dynamic?
No, and that's not part of this conversation. I'm assuming when you talk about full spectrum products, these are CBD products that are on the market that contain 0.2% controlled cannabinoids. If they're CBD products, however you want to describe them, they're narcotics. Unfortunately, it should have been advised by trade associations. They can never be a food.
What if it refers to cosmetics and vapes, though? I again, the 0.2% is a little stumbling block, but the question's valid.
Not non-food, in which case, if we're talking about topicals, drugs legislation still applies. So any topical, any cream, any vape, anything that contains controlled cannabinoids is a narcotic, and possession of such could lead to a charge of possession. Possession of supply ultimately proceeds of crime. So the drugs legislation carries across vapes, cosmetics. From a regulatory perspective, you are permitted to have CBD in a topical product at the moment, and that's the only cannabinoid. We're looking at CBG in products, but the main issue here is to make sure that there is an absence of controlled cannabinoids, because if somebody tests your cream or your vape and it contains controlled cannabinoids, then it's an offence.
You got anything to add to that, Mark? Nope. Okay, I'll just switch on to the ACI question, which I feel is going to be a bit of a hard one to answer. Irish food regulators are trying to whitewash THC out of the supplement market here. Have they coordinated with the ACI? This is from Mark McDonald. Mark, I feel that might not be the case. I'm going to suggest that certainly in Ireland, they have been, through the course of novel foods, they've been one of those that are quite vocal. When it comes to THC, though, that's not something that I know about. So, Mark, are you aware of this kind of whitewashing of THC out in Ireland?
Well, it depends which part of Ireland, but in effect, there's a very different approach to controlled substances and CBD products in Ireland. The Gardaí are all over the place on these type of things. It's well publicised of them shutting down shops left, right, and centre. So they've got a different view to what's going on in the UK. So yeah, I mean, the ACI thing, I think, had nothing to do with that. I mean, it's only of their benefit for the industry to last, and more people sign up to that association, the same as any other trade association. So I don't think they want to rubbish any products that are on the market. But yes, I'm not a believer in the conspiracy stuff, because how do you prove anything? In the end, you've still got to do business irrespective of what other people are doing. All you can do is try and protect your clients and make sure that, they're doing the right thing. And, the way Steve works in terms of trying to provide a good estimation of what's going to happen down the line. So The business can think, okay, these are the possible challenges. This is what I need to deal with today. This is what I might need to deal with tomorrow. So I need to start putting some plans in place. And that's the best you can do. And if there's rogue players in the industry trying to, the whole GW stuff and everything else, well, that's above our pay grade. We're not going to have, any amount of cash to deal with that type of issue. That's political. You need to speak to a lobbying consultancy and, what type of things they can do. But at our level, it's about dealing with what goes on day to day with business and how we can best support business. And as in this presentation, industry.
Yeah. I'll just add to that no, I mean, it's not a conspiracy to ACI. I mean, the FSAI out of Dublin were removing products from and testing them, moving them out of Holland and Barrett and the high street in 2019-20 and publicly providing a list of them. THC is not permissible. Northern Ireland, unfortunately, were jettisoned after the withdrawal agreement. So I remember pointing out the small print that if you were Northern Ireland, part of the United Kingdom, you'd have thought that you were part of our approach. But the small print had a little link and it sent you to the EFSA. So, yeah, Northern Ireland's dealt with by the EFSA along with Ireland. And, yeah, as Mark says, zero approach to THC. That one we can't pin on the ACI.
Right. No, but for anything else, feel free to email me because I'm the one who deals with the conspiracies. So moving on. Now, we've got just enough time to touch on the ACMD angle. I'm going to be a little bit choosy with the questions, though. So first off, the Home Office has suggested the introduction of defined serving sizes for CBD or cannabinoid-containing products. How do you envisage this shift, considering the recent recommended 10 milligram ADI for CBD? How should it factor into determining serving sizes for different product categories? I'm going to leave that open to whoever wants to answer that first.
I think we've discussed it.
Yeah, I think we've done that one to death. Yeah. I mean, there's a question there from Rory, actually, which has just come up.
Rory, okay. Right. Okay. Hello, Rory. Yes, he goes, is labeling that purposes higher dosages above 10 milligram daily for limited periods of time likely to be compliant in the future?
Simple answer is we don't know. I think at the moment their advice is don't change the labels. Labels are going to have to change. So labels will have to reflect dosage. The vulnerable groups that Mark talked about before. So I think we're going to be including people that are trying to procreate. I think we'll probably have to find some wording that's agreed to broaden that vulnerable group. And I think we will have dosage which relates to whichever ADI they settle on. I suspect they will settle on the 10. And I suspect they will give industry participants who are moving through the authorization process a period of time to extinguish existing stock and make sure that they commit to labeling new stock appropriately. How long that will be, I don't know. Whether it's on the case-by-case process, I don't know. The FSA tend to like to put a date on it, but I cannot see current labeling continue because it is confusing for consumers.
What about you, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, the way I sort of see that question is more to do with things like bioaccumulation. So yes, we have the ADI, but the issue is, okay, if you go above the ADI, and we have this with whatever happens with the novel food submissions, and it accumulates in the body. So what happens basically is you have more and more in your body because it's stored in fats and other tissues. Therefore, does that lead to toxicity over time? Now, I've never seen it in a product, but I do see it on some traditional herbal medicines and definitely in medicines where you have a labeling thing to say. So let's say, for example, you take 50 milligrams of CBD every day for 3 months. You get a certain amount in your system. And we know from the 90-day studies at that level, you have a certain amount of toxicity depending on what the dose is. And then you normally, as part of your study, you have a 28 to 30 odd day washout period. and you see basically a lot of the issues that look like that could potentially indicate toxicity, like elevated liver levels, these disappear after 30 days of recovery. So it might be a case, depending on who's spending the money and what data you've got for your client, we actually know what the washout period is from CBD from the body. So let's say it's 3 months, or let's say it's 6 months. So maybe the labeling is, okay, you can take 50 milligrams every day for 3 months, and then you must have a 3 month to 6 month absence period. Now, my view is it's probably, so it's likely that the FSA are not going to accept that for a food product, because obviously people just decide, we'll just keep using that dose for as long as we want to keep using it. And obviously there's an increased risk there of toxicity, because we know that above the 90 days, you've got an issue. So that's some of the problems, but I do think there should be some more bioaccumulation work. We did some a couple of years ago for our client. But what you really want to look at is, okay, what is the actual clearance rate? Now, you can do some very smart calculations to estimate what that is. And I think there's probably enough data there now where you could actually do that. But you need someone who's a bit cleverer than I am to model that. But you could probably predict, okay, well, over a certain amount of time, we can see what the washout period is. Now, we've got it for THC, for example, because that's been assessed for a much longer time. And we know that with people who've been, smoking joints, you can have THC in your system for well over 6 months. But there's some data that actually looks at what the actual release rates are. Some reintoxication data about if you do some exercise, you release it back into the system. So there's lots of other little things here that could be considered by the scientific committees. But again, this comes back to the whole thing of, okay, this is risk assessment, not risk assurance. Mm-hmm. Know that it's safe for 3 months. What's a better way to monitor this rather than spend a load more money on things? Because the science will come eventually. Let's monitor the population. Let's monitor a subgroup. Let's have some type of reporting if there's any conditions. And I think that's probably the best option. So yes, I think there probably could be a higher dose than what the ADI is, but it's going to be a debate following all of the approved or non-approved novel food submissions we've got going through already.
We've already seen it in other jurisdictions where they've limited the use to 28 days. So bearing in mind how cautious they are, I mean, if we say it's 10, I cannot see them allowing labelling to take more than 10. I would think they'll double down, and it will be 10 milligrams per day. Do not use for more than 28 days in any 60 or 90 day period. That would be the way I think they would go for the authorization.
What the dose is, because I know there's Health Canada. They had it was either 150 or 200. And the TGA in Australia, they had either 150 or 200, and one of them had a 30 day or 28 day. Yeah. It's okay for that, and then you need to be off.
Yeah. So, and I think those have an influence. I mean, God, we'd be happy with that, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
Right, folks, listen, my absolute apologies. I feel like we haven't been able to get through all of this. I am going to have to shoot off because Mrs. Hemp Hound is about to walk through the door, which means Puppy is just about to go absolutely loopy. Oh, you're going to catch a little bit right now. So, listen, I would like to invite you both back for a slightly shorter webinar to touch a little bit more on depth on the ACMD guidance. Is that something you guys would be happy with?
No chance.
No.
I'm on out. It'll take me all this time to recover.
Yeah. That is the longest 60 minutes I've had this week.
Yeah. Well, it's been a great call, and thank you very much for joining me, and of course the people who are on. So on that, this is Kevin Jones from the Hemp Hound Agency, Stephen Oliver from the Canna-Consultants, and Mark Tallon from Legal Product Group Limited. Feel free to check us out online for any services that you might need, because we've all got strengths, and like I said, conspiracies come this way. Have a great day, folks, and we will catch you soon. Ta-da.
Thank you, Kevin. Take care. Bye-bye.